The Cold War era was a pretty stressful time to be alive. Daily life was clouded with rumors and paranoia about an impending doomsday. Each morning posed the possibility of the extinction of mankind and the rest of the Earth, as two superpowers glared at each other from across the ocean, waiting for the other to make the mistake of starting a nuclear war. When they weren't growling at each other like rabid dogs, the United States and the USSR were coming up with wild schemes in the name of machismo. And when we say wild, we mean out of this world wild. Like blowing up the moon with a nuke. We're talking about the time when the USA came this close to attacking the moon with a nuclear bomb. Luckily, they didn't push the button, but feel free to hit that like button anytime. In the early days of the Cold War, Americans were too high on their World War II victory to take the USSR as a real threat. Even when the USSR detonated their first nuclear bomb in 1949, nobody in the U.S. took it seriously because of America's assumed nuclear superiority. But when the Soviets launched the first artificial satellite in 1957, the Americans were shook. Sputnik was a non-hostile satellite, but the idea of Soviet rockets successfully reaching up into the Earth's orbit knocked the confidence of Americans of their own country's defense. For the U.S. government, this was a wake-up call. In the 50s, the American space program was still on the ropes, and now the country was in dire need of assurance that they were still 2 steps ahead of Soviet Russia. So, the Eisenhower administration came up with a secret project, a study of lunar research flights. If that name was meant to bore people out of caring about it, mission accomplished. A study of lunar research flights may sound like an innocent research project on space travel, but this was an intentional move to mask its true and super whack purpose: detonating a nuke on the moon. Armor Research Foundation, which is now part of the Illinois Institute of Technology, spearheaded the investigation, and one of the lead researchers was a student by the name of Carl Sagan. Yep, the same man who would become the predecessor of celeb scientists like Bill Nye and Neil deGrasse Tyson was enlisted for this lunar leveling. His contribution was the calculation of how much the detonation would affect the behavior of dust and gas on the moon. It might seem like a loony idea today, but back then, the Eisenhower administration actually believed that the detonation of a nuclear missile on the lunar surface would scare the Soviets and thus restore the faith of the American population in their government. Sure, blowing things up always solves everything. While we can thank Carl Sagan's biography for bringing Americans' plan to nuke the moon to light, the Soviet plan was revealed in the 2010s by the German Historical Institute in Moscow. Somehow, the USSR got wind of the American plot to nuke the moon at the end of 1957, and in early 1958, they began their own plans to do the same thing, just to beat the US in another petty and meaningless race. Under the codename E, the Soviet plan was part of a series of proposals. Project E1 entailed plans to reach the moon, while Projects E2 and E3 involved sending a probe around the far side of the moon to take a series of photographs of its surface. The final stage of the project, E4, was a nuclear strike on the moon as a display of force. Good night, moon. Americans were ready to nuke the moon in 1959 as the American Air Force had begun deploying ICBMs, or intercontinental ballistic missiles. But by now, the scientists behind this project were thankfully beginning to have second thoughts. American physicist Leon Riefel, who was heading one of the teams responsible for the research, stated later in his life that the team was definite they would have hit the moon with an accuracy of within 2 miles. As the moon has a diameter of 2,159 miles, they had a pretty sure shot of creating a cool-looking mushroom cloud on the moon and ruining romantic evenings for the rest of time. However, the optics weren't going to be as sweet as everyone had hoped for. Mushroom clouds from a nuclear explosion are caused by the movement of dust and debris kicked up in a dense atmosphere. The moon, on the other hand, is a vacuum. It has some gases hanging around on its surface, but it doesn't have a dense atmosphere like Earth's, meaning that there'd be no resistance to the expansion of the nuclear-produced dust and debris. It would just keep going and going, instead of curling back to the surface. No big plume, no sound or shockwave, no push down from the air pressure, and no mushroom cloud. Just a lot of dust. Womp womp. Big fun. Oh boy. Still, the detonation would have caused a giant flash which would be noticeable from Earth, but a few seconds of an intense flash beam wasn't something both countries were looking forward to. They wanted to create a long-lasting image to be printed as propaganda in newspapers and displayed in cinemas for the ages. Basically, they were doing it entirely for the gram. Aside from the reasoning that it wouldn't just look cool enough, there were also concerns about contaminating the moon with radiation. And if by chance the mission catastrophically failed, as several endeavors into outer space have, the missile could plummet back toward Earth, endangering people here on the home planet. That'd be a pretty embarrassing way for humankind to go out. We'd be the laughingstock of aliens everywhere. So, the nuke the moon plan was luckily abandoned by both sides. The Americans and the Soviets instead turned their attention to landing a man on the moon. And thank our lucky stars, we still have a big bright pizza pie in the sky. Still gotta watch out for werewolves though. Let us know in the comments what you think about this shady scheme.